Under the fluorescent lights of the packed courtroom, the sound of a gavel cracked through the silence. "Control that dog or I will have it removed," barked Judge Harland, his voice sharp enough to cut through the hush that had fallen over the crowd. Every head turned toward the small figure seated at the witness stand, a girl no older than 12, with hair tied back in a trembling braid and wide eyes fixed on the judge. Her name was Emily. She didn't flinch at his words. Instead, she lifted her hand, subtle but deliberate, and gave the tiniest signal to the German shepherd at her side. The dog, Titan, shifted instantly, his muscles tightening as though he had been waiting for that one gesture all along. The spectators stirred uneasily. A ripple of whispers threaded through the rows of polished benches, bouncing off the cold marble walls. Nobody expected a child to bring an animal into this moment, especially not here, under oath, where truth weighed heavier than steel chains. The judge leaned forward, adjusting his glasses, suspicion etched across his face. Emily's hand remained still, but Titan's sharp gaze locked on a man sitting at the far end of the defense table. The man froze. His jaw clenched, his shoulders stiffened. Every eye followed the dog's unblinking stare. It was as though Titan had reached into the room and torn away the curtain of normality, exposing something raw, something hidden. Emily's small chest rose and fell quickly, but she did not speak. The silence was louder than any voice. And then, as if pulled by an unseen thread, the man averted his eyes, fumbling with the papers in front of him. The tension grew unbearable. "Miss Emily," the judge said, his tone softer now, laced with warning, "you must explain what you are doing." His words echoed, but Emily's lips stayed pressed together. She looked only at Titan, and Titan looked only at the man. The courtroom was no longer a place of law. It was a stage where something larger, more dangerous, was about to surface. Then the first crack appeared. A witness on the other side of the aisle shifted uneasily, their chair scraping against the wood. The defense attorney leaned forward, whispering furiously to his client. And in that instant the man's face betrayed him. A twitch at the corner of his mouth, a sheen of sweat across his temple. The kind of slip that told everyone in the room that Titan hadn't made a mistake. Gasps spread through the benches like wildfire. The jury leaned forward, caught between disbelief and fascination. Emily's signal had been small, but its effect was monumental, shifting the balance of the entire trial in a single breath. Judge Harland slammed the gavel down again, but this time it was not in anger. It was in alarm. "Stop everything!" his voice thundered, startling even the bailiffs who had stood at attention for hours. He pushed himself upright, eyes darting between the child, the dog, and the man under scrutiny. The dog had not moved closer, had not made a sound, but the truth hung heavy in the air, undeniable. The prosecutor seized the moment, his voice slicing through the chaos. "Your Honor, I believe what we are witnessing is not a disruption, but evidence." The words landed like stones in a still pond, sending ripples of shock across the courtroom. Emily finally spoke, her voice trembling but steady enough to pierce the tension. "Titan knows," she whispered, her small hands gripping the edge of the wooden stand. "He always knows when someone is lying." A wave of murmurs filled the chamber, some scoffing, others whispering in awe. Judge Harland raised his hand. For silence, his expression unreadable. He studied the girl with an intensity that suggested he was no longer certain of what rules governed this moment. Titan, ever vigilant, had not blinked once. For the first time since the trial began, the man at the defense table shifted violently, knocking over his glass of water. The clear liquid spilled across the polished wood, spreading toward the papers he had guarded so closely. He cursed under his breath, and in that slip, the courtroom caught a glimpse of something far darker than spilled water. His composure was crumbling. Emily sat straighter, the braid down her back trembling as though charged with electricity. She did not gloat. She did not smile. She simply kept her hand resting where Titan could see it. Her eyes filled not with fear, but with something more resolute. The crowd leaned in, breathless. Judge Harland's voice dropped to a low, deliberate tone. "This court will recess. Immediately." The gavel struck again, not with finality but with dread. Chairs scraped, murmurs swelled, and guards moved quickly toward the defense table. Titan did not move, but his presence dominated every corner of the room. Emily lowered her hand, resting it gently against Titan's fur. The German shepherd finally blinked, his posture easing but his gaze never leaving the man. The little girl had given a single signal, and in doing so, she had unraveled the fragile veil covering the truth. The judge had stopped everything, but deep down, everyone knew the story was only beginning. The hallway outside the courtroom buzzed with restless energy, the kind that builds when people sense they've just witnessed the first tremor of something about to break wide open. Emily sat on a wooden bench against the wall, her small hands buried in Titan's thick fur. The German shepherd leaned close, steady as a wall beside her, though his ears flicked at every sound. A shuffled shoe, a hushed whisper, the metallic clink of handcuffs down the corridor. The air smelled faintly of polish and sweat, a stale mix that clung to the courthouse walls. Emily kept her chin up, but her braid trembled each time she exhaled. Across the hall, Judge Harland had stepped into a private room with the prosecutor and defense attorneys, voices raised in muffled argument. Behind the heavy oak door, every now and then a word bled through. Unprecedented, admissible, intimidation. None of it made sense to the girl, but she understood one thing. Titan had seen something the grown-ups hadn't, and now they were scrambling to make sense of it. She glanced toward the bailiff who stood nearby, arms crossed, his stern gaze fixed on the man at the defense table. The man sat alone now, shoulders hunched, his expression darker than before. A bead of sweat slid down his temple, and when Titan's eyes found him again through the doorway, he shifted uncomfortably as if burned. The recess dragged on, each minute stretching taut. Finally, the door opened, and Judge Harland emerged with a face carved in stone. He motioned for everyone to return. The benches filled quickly, whispers rippling until the gavel struck once more. "Order," he commanded, his voice carrying a weight that silenced even the restless shuffling of papers. "This proceeding will resume, but under new direction." All eyes turned to Emily as she was called back to the stand. She climbed into the chair, Titan padding close behind, his nails clicking softly against the polished floor. The judge's gaze met hers, stern, searching, but not unkind. "Miss Emily," he said slowly, "explain to this court what just happened. What was that signal?" His words rang with both authority and something quieter beneath it, a cautious curiosity. Emily swallowed, her voice almost too small for the vast chamber. "Titan's trained," she said, each word carrying the courage it took to push it past her lips. "Not just for protection. He knows when people lie. He's been with me since I was little, and I trust him more than anyone." She hesitated, her eyes flicking toward the man at the defense table. "When I gave the signal, I asked him to show me if it was true, and he did." A murmur rose among the jury. The defense attorney leapt to his feet, his tone sharp with outrage. "This is absurd, Your Honor. We cannot allow theatrics from a child and her pet to derail the sanctity of this trial." His voice cracked at the edges, betraying nerves beneath the performance. Titan's ears perked, his stare unwavering. But before Judge Harland could respond, the prosecutor stood, holding up a file. His voice was calm, but edged with steel. "Your Honor, we've just received additional evidence." A witness came forward during recess, and their statement corroborates the very moment Titan reacted. He paused, letting the words settle like dust after a storm. The defendant wasn't just nervous, he was hiding something. The man at the defense table shot up, fists slamming against the polished wood. "This is a setup," he barked, his face twisted in anger. The bailiffs moved instantly, stepping in closer, but it was Titan who froze him mid-motion. One step forward, one low growl rumbling from deep within his chest, and the man's defiance faltered. His hands trembled as he lowered himself back into his chair, muttering under his breath. Emily's breath caught, her small fingers tightening on Titan's collar. The room felt heavier now, charged with a truth nobody could ignore. Judge Harland's eyes flicked to the jury, then back to Emily. "What you're asking us to believe is extraordinary," he said carefully, "but extraordinary doesn't mean impossible." His gavel struck softly this time, more a warning than a command. "Proceed." The prosecutor stepped forward, his voice cutting through the silence. Miss Emily, when you say Titan knows when someone lies, how does he show it? Emily glanced at Titan, her lips parting with hesitation. He doesn't bark, not unless he has to. He just locks on. He doesn't look away, and if it's really bad, he growls. Her words trembled, but the weight of them pressed into every ear. That's what he did today. The judge leaned back, his expression unreadable, while the jury shifted restlessly, torn between doubt and the evidence unfolding before their eyes. The defense attorney sputtered, trying to regain footing, but each attempt rang hollow in the wake of the girl's quiet conviction. Then came the twist. A court officer entered with a sealed envelope, handing it directly to the prosecutor. The man tore it open, scanning quickly before his eyes lifted, sharp and blazing. "Your Honor," he said, voice resonant with gravity. "Inside this file is a signed confession, not from the defendant, but from an accomplice, naming him directly." The courtroom erupted, voices colliding in chaos. Judge Harland pounded his gavel, shouting for order, but the storm had already broken. The defendant's face drained of color, his body collapsing into the chair as though the weight of his own lies had finally crushed him. Titan remained steady, gaze unyielding, as if he had known this moment would come all along, and through the noise, Emily sat tall, her hand resting against Titan's neck. She didn't smile, she didn't cry. She only watched as the truth, heavy and unstoppable, filled the chamber like a rising tide. The girl had given one signal, and the tide had shifted. What came next would not just decide the trial, it would decide everything. The courtroom had emptied to a restless hum during recess, yet even in the hallway, the weight of what had just happened clung to every word and movement. Reporters pressed against the wooden doors, whispering theories, their cameras flashing at anyone who looked connected to the case. Emily sat quietly on a bench in the corner, her small hands wrapped around Titan's collar, grounding herself in the steady warmth of his presence. She did not look like a child caught in the spectacle of a trial. She looked like someone carrying a secret she knew no one else could understand. Judge Harland had retreated to his chambers, pacing in sharp steps, the echo of his gavel still ringing in his ears. He had seen lies in his courtroom before. He had seen theatrics, but nothing had ever shaken the walls the way a child's signal to her dog just had. He pressed his palms against the desk, trying to steady the tremor in his fingers. To admit the possibility that Titan had detected what human eyes had failed to catch was to admit that justice itself was not always blind. It could see through the instincts of something beyond human logic. Inside the recess room, the defense attorney clutched at his client, hissing under his breath, demanding composure. But the man's composure had already begun to rot away. Sweat stained the collar of his shirt. His gaze flickered nervously toward the door as though expecting the dog to burst through at any moment. "It's just a trick," he muttered, his voice too loud, too brittle, "just a child playing games." Yet even he could not drown out the memory of Titan's eyes, locked on him with the quiet certainty of a verdict that no jury could escape. Emily's guardian, a woman with tired eyes and a voice that carried years of unspoken battles, knelt beside her in the corridor. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered, brushing a strand of hair from Emily's face, but Emily shook her head firmly. He wouldn't stop unless Titan showed him. The words were soft, but they carried an edge that silenced further protest. It was not the voice of a child who had acted on impulse. It was the voice of someone who had seen truth cornered and refused to let it slip away. When court resumed, the air inside was heavier, charged with something invisible yet undeniable. The jury filed back into their seats, their eyes drawn, not to the attorneys but to the girl and her dog. Even the bailiffs kept glancing toward Titan, as though he were no longer just an animal but a force tethered to something far older and more primal. Judge Harland's gavel called for order, but the silence that followed was thick with anticipation. The prosecutor rose, his voice steady but sharpened by what he had witnessed. "Your Honor, I request permission to call an unscheduled witness. Not one with words, but one with instincts." The courtroom erupted with gasps, and the defense attorney immediately shot to his feet. "Objection! This is absurd. This is a court of law, not a circus." But the prosecutor pressed on. Absurd or not, everyone in this room saw what happened. and if the truth has a way of surfacing through Titan, we owe it to justice to see where it leads. The judge's eyes lingered on Emily, who sat silently, her small fingers knotted in Titan's fur. He saw no mischief in her face, no theatrics in her posture. He saw resolve, and it unnerved him. After a long pause, he nodded. "Proceed, but tread carefully." The defense attorney cursed under his breath, his client gripping the arm of the chair as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. When Emily was asked to return to the stand, the room held its breath. She rose, Titan at her side, every step small yet unshakable. The wooden boards creaked under their weight, and with each sound, the man at the defense table seemed to shrink further into himself. Emily raised her hand again, the smallest signal. Titan did not bark, did not lunge. He simply fixed his gaze once more on the accused, his entire body tense with silent conviction. And then something happened that no one expected. The accused broke. His voice cracked through the silence, a desperate shout tearing from his throat. "Call it off! Get that dog away from me!" The courtroom exploded into chaos. Gasps, shouts, the scrape of chairs against the floor filled the air. The judge slammed his gavel, demanding order, but his voice was swallowed by the storm. Emily stood frozen, her hand still hovering above Titan's collar, her wide eyes reflecting the unraveling of a man who had thought he could control every detail of his story until the dog stripped it away. In the frenzy, Titan never moved closer. He didn't need to. The truth had already been forced into the open, raw and undeniable. The accused buried his face in his hands, trembling, while the prosecutor's gaze hardened with the weight of victory and responsibility. Judge Harland rose to his feet, his voice low but cutting through the noise like a blade. "This court has just witnessed what no testimony, no cross-examination, and no argument could achieve. And now, the burden of truth has shifted." The room went still. Again, the weight of those words pressing against every chest. Emily lowered her hand at last, resting it gently on Titan's head. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire courtroom was no longer ruled by law, but by something far older and far more certain. Yet beneath that moment of revelation, questions still lingered, questions that promised the trial was far from over. The air inside the courthouse hallway felt heavy, as though every whisper carried the weight of revelation. Emily sat with Titan at her side, her small hand buried in the thick fur around his neck. The German shepherd sat tall, calm, yet alert, his amber eyes fixed on the defense table even as the recess emptied the room. The defendant, Marcus Hale, shifted under the gaze of guards now posted around him, his composure unraveling in thin threads. He had arrived in court a man of polished arrogance, but Titan's silent accusation had stripped that confidence away. Judge Harland had retreated to chambers, but the jury had not been dismissed. They lingered, murmuring among themselves, exchanging glances that told of minds already shifting. This wasn't ordinary evidence. This was something raw, something instinctive. Emily hadn't spoken much, but what she did say had echoed. "Titan knows." Those two words clung to the air like smoke, impossible to sweep away. The prosecutor, a tall man named Reynolds, leaned against the rail and studied Emily. He didn't see a child fidgeting nervously. He saw a witness far stronger than she appeared. He crouched down beside her, speaking in a low tone meant only for her ears. "Emily, you understand what just happened in there, don't you? Titan didn't just point him out, he shook the whole room." Emily nodded but said nothing. Her eyes were wide, not with fear, but with the knowledge that she and her dog had crossed a line from which there was no return. On the other side, Marcus's attorney whispered furiously, but it was useless. The man at the center of it all sat, rigid, knuckles white against the table's edge. A bead of sweat trailed down his cheek, betraying a storm he could no longer hide. Titan's gaze never wavered, and Marcus seemed to shrink under it, as though the animal could strip away every layer of his defense until only the truth remained. The bailiff called for silence as Judge Harland re-entered. His expression was grave, his voice steady but edged with something close to unease. "This court was not prepared for what we witnessed, yet it cannot be ignored. Order must be maintained, but so must truth. We will proceed, but with caution. His eyes rested on Emily, lingering longer than protocol required. "Young lady, your signal, your dog's reaction. This is not ordinary testimony, and yet perhaps it is necessary." The tension deepened when Reynolds called Emily back. To the stand. Titan rose with her, his steps measured, his frame commanding attention. Every shuffle of the jury, every sigh from the benches, filled the room like a drumbeat leading to revelation. Marcus's jaw tightened as Emily sat down, Titan lowering beside her once more. "Emily," Reynolds said gently, "did Titan ever react this way before?" She hesitated, her voice trembling but clear. "Yes, once, when the police asked me to help after the night they found my mom." A hush fell over the room. Her words carried more weight than any cross-examination. Marcus's head dropped, his hands trembling now, though he tried to hide it. The judge's hand froze above his gavel, his face pale. The spectators leaned forward, caught between horror and anticipation. The story had shifted. This was no longer just a trial about evidence. It had become something personal, bound by the bond between a child and her dog. Titan's ears twitched, his body stiffening again. His gaze snapped back to Marcus, sharper, harder, unyielding. Emily's hand trembled as she steadied him, but her eyes locked on Marcus, holding him in the same way Titan did. It wasn't rage that filled the silence. It was truth clawing its way into the open. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to stop breathing. Marcus's lawyer tried to object, his voice breaking under the strain, but the damage had already been done. Everyone saw it. The way Marcus's composure cracked, the way Titan's eyes bore into him, the way Emily refused to look away. The weight of the moment was undeniable, and the trial had turned into something far greater than anyone had expected. And just as Judge Harland raised his gavel once more, as though to steady the storm, Titan let out a low, resonant growl that vibrated through the floor. It was not wild or out of control. It was a warning, a sound that made Marcus jolt back in his chair, his mask shattering before the eyes of the world. The silence that followed was electric, and everyone knew the climax was near. The gavel struck once more, but the sound could not silence what had already broken loose. Marcus Hale's mask collapsed under the crushing weight of Titan's unyielding gaze and Emily's quiet courage. His lips trembled, words spilling out in fragments that sounded less like a defense and more like confession. The courtroom froze, the jury watching not a man of power but a man cornered by truth he could no longer outrun. Emily did not move, her small hand still resting against Titan's fur, steadying herself with the same calm that had steadied him. She had carried more than any child should, yet in this moment she was unshaken. The judge, his sternness softened, leaned forward as if even he understood the trial had been decided not by legal argument, but by the unwavering loyalty of a dog who refused to let lies breathe. Marcus buried his face in his hands. The final. Strands of denial slipping away. Guards closed in, and the hush of the crowd broke into a tide of gasps and murmurs. For the first time since the trial began, Emily exhaled deeply. Titan, sensing the shift, relaxed but did not look away until Marcus was escorted from the room. His duty, unspoken but absolute, was done. Judge Harlan's voice carried through the chamber, not with the cold finality of law, but with something gentler, almost reverent. "Let the record show that truth finds its way, sometimes in ways beyond our understanding. Justice has been served." He paused, his eyes lingering on Emily and Titan. "This court is adjourned." As the benches emptied and footsteps echoed against the marble floor, Emily rose slowly, her hand still in Titan's fur. They walked together toward the heavy doors, not as child and pet, but as equals bound by trust that had pierced through walls stronger than stone. The morning light streamed through the high windows, painting them in gold as they stepped into a world forever changed. And for all who had witnessed it, one image remained long after the gavel's echo faded. A little girl and her dog, standing against silence, proving that loyalty and truth can triumph where fear once ruled.